Hi everyone, welcome to the second edition of Edge Talks. I'm your host Praveen Khantar. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused unprecedented damage to India's school children. Our children have had inadequate access to learning. We are unsure when and how long schools will remain open in the face of third wave. How would we cope with both the learning and the psychological trauma which children have faced in the last 18 months? And worryingly, some children may actually never return back to schools. To talk about what could be done in the face of such overwhelming odds, I have with me two outstanding leaders who have influenced both the policy and practice in making our education system more inclusive. Safina Hussain, founder and executive director of Educate Girls, an organization focused on mobilizing communities for girls' education in some of the most backward areas of India. Welcome, Safina. Our second guest is Sonali Seni, founder director at Solzak, working on inclusive pedagogy, training, and delivery in the school education system. So welcome, Sonali.
Hi, Praveen. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
It's great to have both of you here. Let me start by asking both of you about how have the last 18 months actually been for the important stakeholders that you work with, especially children. And also, I think, and this doesn't get talked about too often, how has it affected your organizations and even you personally, right? Because nonprofits have gone through some really tough time. So maybe we can start by, you, Safina, how have the last 18 months been for you?
The last 18 months have been really, really, really difficult and really tough, I think, across the stakeholders, whether we're talking about our communities, we work in some of the most rural, remote, tribal areas, so the loss of livelihood, migration, the impact on children and specifically on girls, has been very deep and very tough. I think as an organization, we've had to pivot to ration relief, to food delivery, because a lot of our areas during the lockdown have been suffering. So, and it's a completely new thing for the organization. But I think there's a lot of pivot that we've had to do, which is also stressful for organizations, for teams. The field teams are still can get out there, but the corporate team, the head office team, 15 months we haven't seen each other. I think the psychological stress on teams is also very difficult. And I think as a leader, you have to sort of reinvent yourself. And we've had to ask for support and be like, what do we do? But really, and I think specifically for girls' education, I have to say, has been really tough because girls' education is all about, the 3 Ps of poverty, patriarchy, and policy. And we've had a 4th P of the pandemic come on board, making it very, very tough on them. Back to gendered roles, back to the lockdown, child marriage, all of those risks have just gone up exponentially.
Great. Thanks, Safina. Sonali?
As an organization, it's been very tough. We work with 2 state governments. We work with Madhya Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. And there was so much happening in terms of reinventing the strategy all the time and figuring out what's going to really work on ground. So a lot of our work really went towards support of what the government was trying to get on ground with, whether it's digital education, whether it is sending workbooks on the ground, whether it is training ground level people to understand how to implement these either in mohalla classrooms or in their homes. So a lot of this was happening, and there was a lot of frustration because everything or every attempt that was happening didn't seem to reach out to all the children. And really for us as an organization, we talk about every last child. Forget every last child, we couldn't even reach 50% of the population. So it was very frustrating, especially from where, what our standpoint is. Are we really reaching out to the most vulnerable children in the classroom? And the answer is clearly been no. So there was a lot of introspection for us as a team internally, that what's really the way to think forward as we work in the inclusion space. And I think this whole pandemic has just exasperated the whole inequity that has been there, whether it's digital, whether it's financial, social, everything has just come out so harshly. And I think all our children, parents, various other stakeholders, including the government and teachers, have really gone through a tough time during this period. And I think we've now grown close to understanding that this is not going to get over. This is the new reality. And I think we're just gearing up towards what does that mean for us, especially in the line of education.
Thanks, Sonali. And I think you touched upon really important points about what are we going to do in terms of schooling, etc. And I'll come to that a little later. Let me start by asking, you, Safina. I think one of the challenges that at least I personally see is, right, in the out of school, like children domain. I remember like talking to government officials, and like they would very proudly brandish the data. And I think this is like, say, way back in 2014, which said that India has like less than 3% of out of school children, and was justifiably so, like one of the biggest achievements of our education system in the last like 20, 30 years, that we've ensured that children are at least having access to like a physical school building, right? And I think right now, where we are speaking, one of the biggest worries that people have, and I don't think so anyone would have an answer, and so probably you'll be the best person to give your inputs on that, is what will happen to the out of school children right now? Like, what is your sense about both the numbers? How will it affect the most vulnerable sections of society? We know what income shock does to things, for example, like education and nutrition. Are there things that we can do to minimize that? So from the vantage point of educate girls and the communities that you work with, like where does the entire out of school children scenario like look like?
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think we have to understand. Yes, you're right that we've made a lot of progress in terms of access. However, there is still a very large number of children who, even pre-pandemic, were not actually in school. Whether they fall off the data map. And the other thing that we've seen is that they also tend to concentrate in certain geographies, and really, at the concentration, there are two things. There is poverty and there's social marginalization. So you're really talking about what Sonali was saying. It's the most vulnerable. Generally, all the out of school children are the most vulnerable. So and so if it was 3%, and now they're saying, after Ebola, out of school children, and especially out of school girl numbers tripled. Are we going to see a similar trend for us, right? Or more? Like, what is it going to really be? Because Ebola wasn't an 18-month or 15-month sort of a lockdown. So I think the situation for the out of school children are going to be very severe. I think their numbers will grow exponentially because the vulnerability has increased because of the poverty, because of loss of livelihood, because of all of those pieces. So I think we have to be very prepared. And I don't think we will be prepared unless we totally understand the granularity of it, because not all out of school children are the same. And I think the way we plan and the way we kind of think about them is really key in being able to just kind of mitigate for that, right? Or to be able to address this situation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. Like, for example, I was teaching a camp last year with tribal children, and one of my boys, he is now working in a coal mine. Right, his mother has gone off, and she's working as construction at a construction site in Bangalore. And this boy, his uncles have taken him, and they're working in some kind of a mine. Now, he was last March, before the lockdown, he was 10 years old, and this year he's going to be 12 years old. That boy, is he really going to come back to school? How are we going to find him? How are we going to make sure that he finds his path back into the school system? And this is one boy, Nitin, that I'm talking about, but there are millions of children like this. For them, this is going to be the new reality. And a 10-year-old to a 12-year-old, his needs might be really different. What has he seen in this time? And is school still going to feel relevant for him to kind of come back, right? So I think there's so much to kind of unpack there, but I think we have to see, and this is a boy. So there are two important things. This is a boy we had data for because he was already in a school system. So we can track him still. But his younger brother would have been 3 years old at the time when the pandemic started. And his younger brother would now become like 5 years old and getting ready to get into first grade. We don't even have data for those children. So there are two problems. One is the children whose data we do have, and how are we going to track them back, and what are all the bottlenecks? The second is the kids, the new enrollments, where we don't have sufficient data. Then we have people who have come in, the migrant kids who've come in, etc. We will need a strategy for finding them as well. I think we will need really a special focus on the transition kids, especially for girls, the transition from 5th to 6th grade. So if you think about it, a girl who was at the end of her 5th grade last March needs admission in 7th grade. And moving from a primary to an upper primary school, we're going to lose her, right? Is that really going to happen? So I think we'll have to really break it down, because there are targeted segments that we will need to really kind of focus on. And I think when we think of back to school or build back better, that is going to be our first and our foremost and our most critical metric of success. Is saying, have all the children, have we found all of them? And have we been able to kind of bring all of them kind of back into school? And I think we will also need to think about the super vulnerable are people who children who are permanently at risk of not, could be COVID orphans, right? They may be at permanent risk of not coming back to school. So we have to have a special strategy for that. And I think finally, like let's say a girl was failed the ninth grade last March. What happens to her? So we will need sort of these permanently at risk who may be beyond the scope of RTE now. They cannot be mainstream, and we will need a plan and a backup plan for those kids, right? Second chance programs. Those are the other pieces that we will have to make sure that those girls who made it all the way up to 8th or 9th can actually still complete that last sprint and still complete their education. Otherwise, it's a huge loss to society. And I think, so that's how we have to kind of really sort of think through this holistically. We've got to break the problem down. And then finally, I think the approach really needs to be to take everybody along, all of your stakeholders. You're talking about your sarpanch, your ward punch, your teachers, like everybody needs to be involved in this in a really kind of strong and authentic way. I think we will have to make the re-enrollment, or when kids come back into school, the enrollment process really seamless. We see this, like sometimes the Samagra ID or the Aadhaar card or all of those things become big bottlenecks. So we'll have to just make sure that we get rid of all this and saying, just come back to school. We will see that another time. And we can't be stuck on the administrative pieces. I think we will have to plan in such a way that we put our enrollment camps in the poorest areas, in the most vulnerable areas, right? Don't put it outside the school. Put it where the community is, where the juggi jhopadis are, and really kind of focus where the Manrega, site is, so that parents don't have to sort of come on a special day. Put it whether near the ration shop or whatever. I think tracking, monitoring, very credible, clear, and authentic messaging to all, and communication to all stakeholders to really reassure them and manage their anxiety. And I think all of this boils down to having the right resources, right? Are the schools going to be funded well enough to have the health, hygiene, other facilities so that the teachers are supported in making all of this kind of happen?
I think you touched upon like the really, really important points because, and I remember people like you talking about that, like what were the success stories of even like mobilizing, Andolan, led by the community to ensure that like the most vulnerable, I think Sonali mentioned the last child, like being enrolled in schools, etc. One natural question comes is that like, what is the role of parents, for example, like, in this entire dynamic? On one hand, you see a lot of demand for education happening. But on the other hand, you also see, for example, especially right now, people are genuinely worried about that, like how much will parents, for example, prioritize education? And even in the interim, what is the role that they can play in terms of like both supporting their children? So what is your point of view there?
So I think the pandemic, one good thing is everybody's kind of realized that there is a parent that can actually be engaged in doing this, right? And pre-pandemic, I think, especially for poor people, right? Because parents have never been to school. I think when their children come into the school, the power dynamic is so unequal. They have always just been talked down to. They have always just been kind of spoken to saying, "Acha, bacche ko dimag kam hai, ye theek nahi hai, wo theek nahi hai, aap aisa nahi karte, aap waisa nahi karte." We've always just spoken at them. And now we're suddenly seeing that there's a real power of engaging with parents authentically, right? And there's a lot that they can bring to the table. We've run Camp Vidyas, which are these small neighborhood camps last year at Educate Girls for over 250,000 children last year. And we've seen the surge of parent engagement. They come in and they help you manage the small group. We've had a lot of people who've come and lectured at the camp. They've said, "Acha, what is the history of our village name?" And then there's an elder person who's coming in and kind of talking about it. And I think there's so much that you can leverage for learning. And we've always just had this block. We've had these sort of mechanical pieces like SMCs, but not authentic engagement and collaboration with parents. So I think that's really the fabulous pieces. Everybody's seeing that there's so much power. In my own camp, I mean, I ran it, this tribal woman, Kashi, she gave me her house to run it in. So in her hut, I collected all the children. She helped me manage the classroom. She sang along all the songs. She would run around and help the kids count all the bartan in her, and every item in her hut so that they could practice their counting. There is so much that they have to give to the education system. And I think we've been, really kind of cut off from that. So I see that, there is a huge piece there. There's a willingness from parents. And however, we have to change our lens on how we speak with them. We have to bridge this power dynamic. We have to stop talking down to parents. We have to really sensitize our entire systems to engage authentically with parents and to really kind of bring them to the table.
Thanks, Safina. And I think you touched upon a very important point, which is also a nice segue to the question that I wanted to ask Sonali, right? Which is the expectation that uh, parents or the teachers have of the children, right? And I think like we have a lot of research now to see that the power differential between, like, say, a teacher and a child, and the low expectations sometimes which are inherent, like, affect the child in a ways that are unimaginable, right? And the best performing systems are those which almost give a guarantee that we'll leave no child left behind, or we will ensure that irrespective of the circumstances, like, children perform. Sonali, like, moving on from like what happens outside the school to what is going to happen in the school, right? What is it that we need to do to ensure that both the safety, the psychological well-being, and the learning loss are taken care of, right? How would the school system, or how should the school system, like, adapt to like this changed environment?
First thing is going to be safe spaces, whether it is in terms of health, hygiene, safety. That is the critical area that we need to work on. And do we really have the budgets for it? I think that's a big question that's been asked. Do we really have set aside a budgets to make sure our wash facilities, our health facilities are appropriate for getting children back? And reimagining now what the classroom is going to look like. If you had a class of 40, obviously that's not going to work. So, what's your restructuring of your classroom going to look like? And what are the children going to do, therefore, on the days that they don't come, or the days that they're going to come to school for a few hours? So, really thinking about the safety, the structure of the classroom before the children even come back. I think that's number one for me in terms of priority. And a pre-think that needs to be done is to identify vulnerability. And I think we need to redefine vulnerability. The way we look at in India, we look at vulnerability as a single factor. There is an intersectionality of vulnerability which is so critical that that's what's going to hamper the children coming back. It's not somebody belonging to a migrant family. It's not only that. It's somebody belonging to an SCST, migrant, having some other special need with them. Those are the children really who are going to need specific strategies to get back. So identifying those children earlier, identifying the barriers to bringing them back, and finding them, like Safina was saying, and we have to find them. We've lost those kids from the system. Some of them who are already there, some of them who have not even been enrolled. Especially for early foundational learning and numeracy, I think grade 1, 2, 3 is going to be very critical right now. With the whole focus on FLN, I think what we need to think about is where are those children right now? Do we have data for these children? Do we even know? Are we talking to, let's say, what the census is showing and what the school data is showing, right? Is there a disparity between the two? And getting the kids back. The next, of course, is going to be what do you do with learning, the gaps that have happened. Somebody who's come in third standard, that means has come with 2 years of no learning at all. And that's a huge leap to take. Are we practically thinking about it? Are we thinking short-term remediation versus long-term intervention that's going to be required, restructuring of the curriculum, meeting the psychosocial needs of both the teachers and the students? I think that is going to be one big piece. We've been talking about holistic education for a very long time, but I think it's only now during the pandemic that people have realized how important mental health is, how important it is to get to make sure that the children are learning holistically and not just reading and writing and doing math. That element has to be integrated very seamlessly in what is done. And that means a lot of capacity building for the teachers and the system as a whole. We as school systems have been invisible to all the populations who are vulnerable, have been invisible to these populations so far. Because for them, it was that my class is even, right? That's really what the perspective in teaching was. Now that you know that the unevenness has even increased more than it was before, are all the children really learning in the classroom? And therefore, how do you rethink learning? How do you rethink bridging? How do you rethink psychosocial support? I think a teacher will almost undergo a new role now. And to focus on that and not look at this as a temporary bandage that we put in is going to be very important as schools open.
Thanks, Sonali, for touching on like such important like aspects of that, right? And I think one area maybe like we want to go a little bit deeper into is not only the role of teacher, but what is it that we could do in terms of preparing, right? And I think like anyone who's worked in education system would realize that even in the best of times, we struggle with our entire, let's say, teacher policies, programs, etc. Right, from training them to like working with them and supporting them, etc. Post pandemic, this becomes even more important. Like there's a lot of like real like learning and relearning and unlearning that has to happen not only for children but also for teachers. Are there some examples that you see like happening which gives you a little bit hope about like what does this teacher 2.0 looks like, or anything in particular that the system can do to support teachers better in their new role?
So there is a lot of push, with multiple organizations like us to rethink on teacher education, to rethink of what is our focus area going to be, what are we facing, and then to set realistic goals. I think the big problem that we are thinking is only from a teacher's perspective, let's retrain the teacher. But are we resetting the academic goals? Are we resetting the goals that we want our children to achieve, considering they've had such a long learning gap? So giving a teacher a realistic goal is going to be the first possible motivator for a teacher to say that, yes, this is possible within the sphere. I'm not saying that cover 3 months or 6 months of remediation and you cover 2 years of life. That's never going to happen. So setting realistic goals, having clear communications of outcomes that you want the teacher to achieve, and dealing with all the psychosocial needs first of the teacher herself. They've had a tough time in these last 2 years. We've lost so many teachers on the, during the pandemic because they've been on the ground. They were teaching at mallas, and so many have been lost out of the system. So really to ensure that we care about their well-being and not first, and then everything else, I think is going to be very, very important to us. So essentially re-looking at, in summary, re-looking at restructuring the curriculum, therefore training the teacher on those lines, looking at psychosocial needs of the teachers, as well as understanding this, how a teacher can identify children at risk in a classroom. Right? Does a teacher have knowledge to understand that a certain child is going through mental health challenges? And therefore, what is it that she should be doing? We don't have additional resources like in developed countries where you have counselors and special educators in the classrooms or in the schools. We don't have that. So therefore, bridging that gap initially through teacher education on risks, on understanding how to manage these in that classroom, and setting that as a priority over the academic and learning outcomes, I think is going to be very important.
Because both of you are here and I know how deeply you've thought about the equity within the education system. I also just want to take a step back, right? And almost, at least for me and a lot of other commentators have written about it, pandemic has just been a revelation of the deep inequity within a system, education or otherwise, right? It was probably the first time people thought about migrant population and realized that in cities, so many migrants actually work, right from construction to even like taking up the odd jobs, etc. there. Specifically from education perspective, what are the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic? And if not the pandemic per se, we know that similar instances are going to happen in the future. How do you think of even designing a system, both in the short term and the medium term, which you can almost make pandemic proof, so to speak, right? Which takes into consideration the access, the equity, the quality. How do we, right from a teacher, a parent, to even the policymakers and the politicians, almost like think of visualizing a system which is pandemic proof, where we don't see, for example, like say, irrespective of anything, like children's learning, their well-being being affected. Is it even possible to design a system like that, like which is so inclusive? Because most high-performing systems by design are inclusive, right? So, Safina, like maybe, like what does the inclusive education system for India look like?
Yeah, you know what? Sonali is the queen of inclusion. So I'd let Sonali kind of go
question
first.
on me.
I'll come to both Sonali and you. I'll come to both Sonali and you.
Very cleverly.
Yeah.
The question.
Yeah. No. I think this is, because now you're asking us about utopia, and we definitely, as people who are in there, live in utopia. We think everything is possible. So that's the lens that this is going to come from. I think to really build an inclusive system, and I think it is possible. And I think we need two or three things, key ingredients, right? I'm not going to get into the specifics. But 2 or 3 key ingredients. And I think the pandemic may make it possible, because the biggest thing that's happened is that we're all seeing that till now we've just been sticking, band-aids on a bullet wound, right? As far as the education system is concerned, when everybody's just coming and putting their little different kind of a band-aid, thoda upar, thoda niche, thoda side pe or whatever, but it's a damn bullet wound, right? And suddenly we're like, oh my God, the way we assess our children needs to be rethought. Oh my God, how much money we're putting into the education system needs to be rethought. So I think we're in a good place. And also I think parents and everybody over the country has realized like how hard it is to teach, how difficult it is. So I think at least we're down at the same baseline, which is great to actually be able to build on this utopia. Now, the way that we can build, the way that I see it is, I think it's money. You can't spend, 3% or under 3% of your budget and expect to get to a really inclusive system. And I think we really have to, focus on that. If we focus on it, the second piece is, I think systems are very mechanical. They're training you on how to teach foundational literacy and numeracy, how to teach ABCD and phonics. They need to become more authentic. How does a teacher really engage or whatever? So I think we have to rethink that. And if we can rethink that and make it authentic versus mechanical, intervention led versus like a holistic piece, I think, and keeping the most vulnerable child at the heart of it. And I think the money, this sort of sensitization of the system, and the third piece is going to be decentralization. You just have to decentralize. But I think if we did these three things, everything else will kind of fall, and everything else we will be able to kind of build on top of it. The other things are just like the activities that you will do. But fundamentally, these three pillars need to really kind of be there.
Okay.
Sonali.
Thank you, Sabina, for starting that off. I think, the utopia really, personally for me, especially being the space of inclusion, is that learning becomes a spectrum, right? This whole graded outcomes, this fight to reach XYZ, at one level is not reality. Even before pandemic, it was never a reality. So can we rethink of a more integral system, which really is a learning spectrum, and every child's ability is respected on that spectrum? While it sounds very utopian, of course it does, but it's not very difficult to achieve. It's not something that is completely, because that's reality. Every child is moving at their own ability. Each child is almost like a ladder system, where you're saying that children will move from X to Y, and somebody may move 2 steps up and somebody 8 steps up, and that's absolutely fine as long as there's movement on that spectrum. So I think moving away, and unfortunately, I think we are still not there in terms of this kind of radical thinking, but we will have to take that step if we want to accept reality and say this is what education system should really be like. And thinking of the most vulnerable when you design, when we always talk about access as children going to school. But what is the access of learning in a classroom? Less than 50% of your children are involved in the learning. How is that access? Just because they're physically present doesn't mean that that's access. So what is it that so we always talk of the bell curve, right? And you have the bottom bell curve and the top bell curve. And you know that both ends of the spectrum are completely unserviced today. So how do you make sure that learning is wider, is more accessible to all the populations that we're talking with, and not just in the middle? So therefore, a rejig or rethinking of what our curricular needs are, what our learning needs are, and again making education personalized. I think Safina already touched on this when she spoke about Nitin. And is education going to be relevant for him today? If education is not relevant for him, he's not going to come back. Or even if he comes back, he'll say, oh, chuck it, it's making no sense to me, because I've seen reality and I've seen what the world is outside, and this is too long away, or this is just not relevant for me anymore. So relevancy, making education more integral and more like a spectrum, I think is the key for us. And of course, some elements of infrastructure, right? We know that digital infrastructure is very weak in our country. While there have been efforts at state level, we need a national level effort to make sure that, almost like at RTI, including your learning, including digital as a right to every child, and making sure that this infrastructure exists. We have so many telecom companies. How many of them have come forward? Or can we create a nationwide act to make sure that the companies allow for digital education for the most inaccessible children? Learning is going to be blended for a very long time. And if we want learning to continue, we will have to account for a better digital infrastructure. And multimodal, again, it can't be one. It has to be TV, radio, mohalla, a whole load of other things that we need to do on. And almost imagine how learning happens. And therefore, if learning is on a spectrum, it's easier to execute than graded learning that we are now following.
Great. No, again, I think like both from Safina and from you, like these are the excellent pillars on which you can like say tinker around and build a truly inclusive education system, right? And I know that people are going to say that, oh, like where will the additional like money come from, or like from the digital infrastructure perspective, like what additional can happen. But I think again, there's a lot that you can do with the existing resources, and there's a lot that you can do with the additional resources. And I know that the evidence-based way in like both Educate Girls and Solzar's work, you both have like some excellent strategies to ensure that like you get like bigger bang for buck for any money that is spent. So and again, this is the final like a question to you, and I'll start this time with Sonali, right? As you look into the future, what is like one thing which really makes you hopeful, and what worries you? Yeah, so.
I think after a long time, I attended one online class that we do so we work with children with special needs, and that's while it's a smaller part of what we are doing now. I went online and interacted with them after quite some time now, and I think the joy that I saw, and the connection that I saw, and the need of all the children to get back to schools. I think that's my hope. They all want to come back. They're all asking, when are you going to open? When are we coming back? Parents are now, I think, finally saying that, yes, this is affecting my child. So the need is so high. And all we need to do is really, build on this hope and get our children back to school.
Okay. Safina, what worries you and what makes you hopeful?
Okay, so I'm going to share. Can I share three worries? And
please.
Yeah, okay. so the big hope. I mean, what makes me really hopeful is for the first time, I feel like as parents, as government, as NGO partners, as specialists, as technical support people, we're all seeing the whole elephant. You know that story of like, people are like, just go tang pakdi hui hai, just it's like, oh, the elephant is like a, it's like a leg. And the one who's holding the tail is like, oh, it's like actually it's kind of hairy at the end, whatever. But at least now we are seeing the whole elephant. And like I said before, I think we've realized that there is a bullet wound in here, and a band-aid approach is not going to work. Little incremental pieces are not going to work. So that makes me really hopeful, because once you can diagnose an illness, that's when you can actually cure it. And for all this time, we have not even diagnosed it as holistically as before. I mean, pre-pandemic, Sonali would have gone horse in the throat talking about equity and inclusion and stuff, and nobody would have even batted an eyelid. They would have, wo baad mein dekhenge, So I think the fact that we're on the same page, we're seeing the entire system, and we're seeing exactly where the gaps are in the entire system, makes me very hopeful, because it's the right starting point for actually fixing things. The things that worry me now, well, the biggest worry is that we might see all of this, and the day the pandemic goes away, we will go back to our bad habits. We will just like forget about it. And that's my biggest worry, that because human beings are like that, when it's just back to back. And then the second is, I think I worry that when we get all the out of school children back into school, I worry that we will, because everybody's so anxious and everybody's talking so much about the learning loss and all the rest of it, that we're going to burden them heavily, and they will need time, and I think, how do you create that space so that you don't suddenly get on top of all the children and saying abhi abcd abhi paro, because they like Nitin, when he comes back as a 12-year-old, you will not have him as a captive audience. The guy he knows how to earn money in a coal mine, right? Unless you make it relevant for him, the kids will up and leave. They have not actually even been in the rhythm of sitting for so long, in a classroom and all the rest of it. So that's my big worry, is unless we really kind of rethink how it is, and we give them enough time and not burden them with our agenda of, getting over the learning loss, and everybody is like really pressuring them, we will create more problems with our children, especially with mental health and other pieces. My third big worry is really, I know that the future is digital, but my worry is that edtech and digital will actually be really bad for inclusion. It is worsening the kind of market failure that we see for like girls. It is worsening because of the digital gender divide, that I think that as more and more money gets plugged into this, that edtech, I find, will be the worst thing that happens for inclusion and equity. And that's my big worry. So unless we think about it right now and we're really intentional about edtech, I think it could worsen stuff for the next 100 years, for generations to come. So yeah, those are my three top worries.
Great. Thank you, Safina and Sonali. Like, this was excellent, and at least I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience would think similarly. So